Welcome to Soft Mystic Stories. In the year 410 of the Common Era, the Roman legions sailed away from Britain. The roads they had built, the cities they had founded, the villas with their tiled floors and their underfloor heating, the temples and the forums, and the baths with their warm water and their painted walls, all of it was simply left behind. And then, for the next 400 years, almost nothing was written down. No chronicles, no letters, no records of who ruled, no records of who fought, no records of who lived, and who died, and who married, and who built, and who burned. An entire civilization, one of the most documented in human history, simply went quiet. The lights went out across an island that had been for nearly 4 centuries part of the largest empire the world had ever known. And when the lights came back on slowly, dimly, sometime around the year 800, the world had changed. The Britons were no longer the rulers of their own island. The Anglo-Saxons had come from where, no one really knows for certain. The old Roman cities were largely abandoned. The language people spoke had shifted. The gods they worshipped had changed. And somewhere in those 4 silent centuries, the country we now call England had been born. But how? How does an entire population vanish from the historical record? How do you lose 400 years? How does a place go from villas and aqueducts and Latin inscriptions on stone to a world of timber, halls and pagan kings, and a language no Roman would have recognized? Tonight, we are going to walk slowly through that long darkness and look at what we know, and what we think we know, and what we will probably never know. The fragments, the hints, the bones in the ground, and the words in the few surviving manuscripts, the names carved on weathered stones in distant churchyards, the shape of the silence itself. Settle in, get comfortable, let your breath slow. There is no rush at all. We have a long, quiet night ahead of us, and the story we are going to tell is older than almost any other story. You know, before we step any further into the fog of those 4 lost centuries, take a moment to do one small thing. If you find these long, slow journeys through history helpful for falling asleep or simply for unwinding at the end of a long day, please consider subscribing to the channel. It costs nothing. It takes a single quiet tap, and it lets us keep making these long-form sleep documentaries for you. While you are there, tap the little bell as well, so the next one finds its way to you when it is ready. There is no need to keep watching the screen. You can close your eyes. You can let the room go dark around you. The voice will keep going gently for a long time. The story will be here, whether you are awake to hear all of it or not. Sleep is not failure here. Sleep is the point. Now, let us go back to the last century of Roman Britain, when no one yet knew what was coming. Back to a province at the edge of an empire, where the soldiers on the walls were beginning to look over their shoulders, and the farmers in the valleys were beginning to wonder how much longer the world they knew would last. To understand how Britain fell into darkness, we have to first picture what Britain looked like when the lights were still on. By the late 4th century, the island had been Roman for almost 400 years. That is a very long time. Long enough that no one alive remembered anything else. Long enough that the great-great-great-grandchildren of the Britons, who had once fought the legions on chariots and in painted skin, were now themselves Roman citizens, speaking Latin alongside their older British tongue, wearing Roman clothes, eating from Roman pottery, burying their dead in Roman cemeteries with Roman grave goods. The province they lived in was called Britannia, and it was divided into 4 smaller provinces by then, each with its own governor, each with its own administration. The capital was the great city of Londinium on the river Tempames, with its walls and its forum, and its bridge and its bustling docks. To the north there was Iberacum, which we now call York, a city of stone and timber that had once held an emperor. To the west there was Glevam, our modern Gloucester, and D.A. Victrix, which is Chester, and Isca, which is Cologne. and also Exut, and many others. To the south, there was Aculus, the city of the hot springs, which we now call Bath, where the steam still rose off the green water in the great bathing complex dedicated to the goddess Sulis, Manurva. There were villas scattered across the southern countryside, hundreds of them, thousands perhaps if you count the small ones, working estates with mosaic floors and hippock heating systems where hot air ran beneath the melicate tiled floors and rose up through the walls. There were workshops producing pottery and glass and metalwork. There were ports trading with Gaul and Spain, and even further. There were Christian churches by then, and synagogues perhaps, and the lingering temples of older gods, both Roman and British, blended together over the centuries into something that was uniquely Romano-British. And along the northern frontier, there was the Wall, Hadrian's Wall, stretching from sea to sea across the narrow neck of the island. 73 miles of stone and turf and ditch, and mile castle, and fort, watching over the lands beyond, watching for the Picts and the other peoples of what we now call Scotland. The wall was old by the late 4th century. It had been built in the 2nd century, and by the time we are talking about it, had stood for more than 200 years. The men who manned it were no longer Italians. They were for the most part locals, or men from other parts of the empire who had married locally, settled locally, raised children who knew nothing of any other home. They lived in the fort towns that had grown up just south of the wall, in places like Vindolanda, and Hausersteds, and Birdsworld, places whose names we still know because their stones are still there. Sleeping in the manned grass, they drank the local beer. They prayed to a mixture of gods. They worried about the same things any garrison soldier has ever worried about: pay, food, the weather, the mood of their officers, the intentions of the people on the other side of the wall. And then, slowly, in ways that no one really noticed at the time, the empire began to come apart. Not all at once. Empires rarely fall all at once. They unravel. They lose pieces. They stretch, and they thin, and they grow brittle. In the late 3rd century, there had already been trouble. Britain had been part of a breakaway empire for a while, ruled by a man named Carausius, and then by a man named Electus, before being brought back into the imperial fold. There had been raids, there had been usurpers, there had been periods when no one was quite sure who the emperor actually was. But things had held together somehow through the 4th century. The cities still functioned, the taxes still flowed, the roads were still kept up, the legions were still paid, more or less on time. What changed was that the troubles on the continent grew worse and worse and worse. There were pressures along the Rhine and along the Danube. Peoples were moving. Whole nations were on the road, pushed by other peoples behind them, who were in turn pushed by others in a great chain of displacement that stretched all the way back into the steppes of Central Asia. The Goths were moving, the Vandals were moving, the Alans and the Suebi and the Burgundians were moving, the Huns were coming, and every time the Western Empire tried to deal with one crisis, 2 more rose up to take its place. And every time it tried to deal with those, the resources had to come from somewhere. The legions had to come from somewhere. And again, in the late 4th century and into the early 5th, troops were stripped out of Britain to fight wars on the continent. A general would rebel, declare himself emperor, gather the British legions to his cause, and march off across the Channel to make his claim, and most of those troops would never come back. It happened with Magnus Maximus in the year 383. He took the soldiers and went to Gaul and was eventually killed, and the soldiers never returned. It happened again with Stilicho, who pulled forces out for his campaigns. It happened again with another user called Constantine, sometimes called Constantine III, in the year 407, who crossed to Gaul with the last significant Roman field army left in Britain, and disappeared into the chaos of the continent. And then in the year 410, something extraordinary happened. The Romano Britons, the citizens of the province, sent a letter to the Emperor Honorius asking for help. Their cities were being raided. Their coasts were being attacked. The Picts were coming over the wall and from the sea. The Scots, who at this point were a people from Ireland, were raiding the western coasts. The Saxons from across the North Sea were raiding the eastern and southern coasts. The province was in danger, and the emperor wrote back, or at least that is what the Byzantine historian Zosimus tells us many years later, in a single, brief passage that is one of the most famous and most disputed passages in all of British art history. The emperor wrote back, Zosimus says, and told the cities of Britain to look to their own defenses. To defend themselves, he could not help them. He had his own troubles. Rome itself was about to be sacked by the Goths under all Alaric. The empire was burning at its heart. And so Britain, after almost 4 centuries as a Roman province, was told in effect, "You are on your own now." That is the traditional date, 410, the year Britain became no longer Roman, the year the long darkness began. And there is something strangely tidy about it, something almost too neat, which has led many historians over the years to question whether it really happened that way at all. Some have argued that the letter from Honorius was actually addressed to Bruttium in southern Italy, not Britannia in the far west, and that the entire story is a misunderstanding by a Greek writer working centuries later. Others have argued that the date is essentially correct, but that nothing much actually changed in that single year, that the withdrawal of Roman authority was a long, slow, drawn-out process that had been happening for decades before 410 and would continue for decades after. The truth, as so often with this period, is that we do not really know. We have one sentence in one late Greek historian, and we have a great deal of archaeology, and we have to try to make sense of the two together. What the archaeology tells us is that something certainly was happening in the early 5th century. Coins stopped arriving from the imperial mints. The supply of new Roman coinage into Britain, which had been steady for centuries, simply ceased around the year 402 or thereabouts. After that, the coins in circulation were the coins already there, gradually being clipped and worn down and lost. Pottery production, which had been on an industrial scale in places like the Nenna Valley and the New Forest, collapsed within a generation. The great pottery kilns went cold. The wheel-thrown wares that had filled every Romano-British household stopped being made in any quantity. Within 50 years or so, much of Britain was using handmade pottery again, or no pottery at all, just wooden vessels and leather bags. Stone building on any large scale essentially stopped. New villas were no longer being constructed. The villas that already existed were maintained for a while, then patched, then partially abandoned, then squatted in by smaller groups, then finally left to fall down. The roads, however, remained. Roman roads are extraordinarily well built. Many of them are still in use today, 20 centuries on, as the foundations of modern British highways. The Watling Street, the Man Street, the Fossway, the Staingate, the great straight cuts across the British countryside. These did not vanish when the legions left. They could not vanish. They were too well made. And so even in the deepest of the dark centuries, people walked on Roman roads. They drove their cattle on Roman roads. They marched their war bands and their migrating families on Roman roads. The infrastructure of empire kept shaping the movement of people long after the empire itself had let go of the island. And then the silence began to fall. The contemporary written sources for Britain in the 5th century are vanishingly few. We have a handful of mentions in continental chronicles, brief and confused. We have a letter from a Gic bishop named Germanus, who came to Britain twice, in the 430s and 440s, to deal with a religious dispute called the Pelagian heresy, and whose biography mentions almost in passing that there were still functioning towns and still organized British leaders. We have the writings of a man named Patrick, the same Patrick who would later become the patron saint of Ireland, who was born in Roman Britain, to a Christian family of some standing, who was taken as a slave by Irish raiders as a young man, who escaped, who eventually returned to Ireland as a missionary. His writings, which survive in just 2 short documents, called the Confessio and the Letter to Chiroticus, give us tiny glimpses of what life in early 5th century Britain was like. A world where Roman titles still meant something, where Christian bishops still wrote letters in shaky Latin, where the children of the elite still received some kind of education, where slave raids from across the Irish Sea were a constant terror. That is most of what we have from inside Britain for the entire 5th century. A handful of letters, a handful of references in foreign chronicles, and then nothing. Just the deep quiet and the long, slow change in the landscape and the slow change in the bones. For decades after the soldiers left, the Romano-British world tried to continue. We can see this in the archaeology. In some places, town walls were repaired and strengthened. The big public buildings, the forums and basilas, were sometimes turned into other uses, divided up into workshops and dwellings, but they were still inhabited. In other places, the towns shrank. People moved out into the countryside. The countryside itself shifted. Some villas were abandoned outright. Others continued with their owners now operating less like Roman gentry and more like local warlords ruling over the lands they could see from their walls. The great church at Roxton, which was once the 4th largest city in Roman Britain, was rebuilt in timber in the late 5th or early 6th century on a scale that suggests a powerful local Fisher lord was still in residence there. The hot springs at Bath kept flowing as they always had, and people still came to them. Though the great bathing complex was slowly silting up, layer by layer, with mud and leaves and the pit dust of years, the tin mines of Cornwall and Devon kept working in some form, because there is evidence that tin was still being exported across the sea to the Mediterranean, where it was traded for fine pottery and amphorae of wine. Some of that imported pottery has been found in the western British hill forts. We will come back to those hill forts later. They are some of the most important sites in this entire story. But while the western and northern parts of the old province continued in their reduced and changing way, something else was happening on the eastern and southern coasts. New people were arriving. They came from across the North Sea, from the lands of what is now Germany, the Netherlands, Denmark, and southern Scandinavia. They came in small numbers at first, then in larger numbers. They came in their long open boats with their carved prows and their square sails, beaching them on the shingle, dragging them up out of the tide line, and then walking inland to see what they could find. Some of them, perhaps most of them at first, were not invaders in the dramatic sense of the word. They were settlers, whole families, men and women and children, with their livestock and their seed corn and their household goods, looking for new land. The lands they had left were not always pleasant places to live. Sea levels had been rising slowly. Coastal flooding was becoming worse. The climate of northern Europe was shifting, becoming colder and wetter in the 5th and 6th centuries. There were good reasons to look across the water at the green and well-watered island of Britain and think that perhaps a new home could be made there. And the Romano-Britons, we should remember, were not entirely surprised by this. The Saxon shore forts, as they were called, had been built along the eastern and southern coasts of Britain in the 3rd and 4th centuries, precisely because raiding from across the North Sea was already a serious problem. Forts like Burgh Castle in Norfolk, like Richborough and Realva, and Pevensey in Kent and Sussex, like Portchester in Hampshire, were strongholds built specifically to deal with sea raiders from what would later become the Anglo-Saxon homelands. There had been Saxon and Frisian and Angle raiders coming to Britain for at least a century before the Romans left. Some of them had been hired as mercenaries by the late Roman authorities, settled in small communities along the coast, in exchange for the duty of fighting off other raiders. This was a very normal Roman practice. set a barbarian to catch a barbarian, pay them in land or in grain or in coin. The system worked more or less while there was still an imperial administration to coordinate and to pay for it. What happened in the 5th century almost certainly was that this system continued under the new local British leaders, but that the balance of power within it slowly shifted. The Saxons and Angles and Jutes, who had been hired to defend the coasts, gradually became too numerous and too well established and too well connected to their kinsmen across the sea to be controlled. Their kinsmen came to join them, their numbers grew, and eventually, somewhere in the middle of the 5th century, the relationship between the incomers and the natives broke down. We do not know exactly how. We do not know exactly when. We do not know whether it was sudden or gradual, whether it was one event or many. What we know is that by the end of the 5th century, the eastern part of Britain looked very different from the western part. In the east, the old Roman towns were largely abandoned. New farms and villages were being built of timber in styles imported from across the sea, with long houses for cattle and people under the same roof, with sunken floored buildings for weaving and craftwork, with pagan cemeteries containing cremation urns and burials with grave goods. In the west, the Roman cities had also largely emptied out, but the old British language continued, and the old British leaders continued, and the connections to the Mediterranean continued. Two different worlds, growing apart, on the same island, in the same century. And the people who lived through this saw none of it as a single story. They saw their own small piece of it. The farmer outside Roxter saw the city walls slowly crumbling on the horizon. The fisherman on the Kentish coast saw the long ships beaching on the sand, and the strangers walking up onto his land. The widow in a Cotswold villa saw her servants leave one by one because there was no longer any money to pay them, and the roof began to leak, and she did not have the means to repair it. The young man on the western coast watched his older brother taken away by Irish slavers and never saw him again. The Christian bishop in a small Welsh town wrote a letter that no one would read for centuries in shaky Latin on parchment that would not survive. The Saxon settler in East Anglia buried his father with a sword and a shield and an iron helmet, and stood by the smoking grave, and looked west at the long flat land going on for miles and thought, "This is mine now. This will be ours." Each of them was living through the same long unraveling, and none of them knew it, and none of them wrote it down, and none of them could have known how it would end. This is what the silence sounds like when you press your ear to it. It is not really silence at all. It is the sound of 1,000 small lives going on, in 1,000 small places, without anyone keeping track. It is the sound of a civilization not collapsing in a single dramatic moment, but slowly forgetting itself, slowly becoming something else. And that is the world we are going to walk through tonight. Slowly, gently, with our eyes half closed, because that is the only way you can really see it. The first voice that comes to us from inside the British darkness, the first voice that speaks at any length about what it felt like to live through these centuries, belongs to a man called Gildas. We do not know exactly when he was born, or where, or who his parents were. We do not know what he looked like, or where he is buried, or whether he ever met any of the people he spoke. So, what we have is a single long document, written in difficult Latin, in a style that draws heavily on the Hebrew prophets of the Old Testament, called on the ruin and conquest of Britain, de excidio at conquesto Britannia. It was probably written sometime in the middle of the 6th century, perhaps around the year 540, perhaps a little earlier or later, and it is essentially a furious sermon. Gildas was a Christian, and almost certainly a monk, and he was writing to scold the kings and the clergy of his own time, whom he considered to be wicked and corrupt and incompetent and a disgrace to their ancestors. He wanted to shake them by the shoulders and tell them how badly they had failed. And in order to do that, he told them the story of how Britain had come to its present state. He told them, in his own bitter and angry way, what had happened in the century and a half before his rebirth, and in doing so, almost by accident, he gave us the only contemporary native narrative we have for the British 5th century. Gildas tells us that after the Romans left, the Britons enjoyed a brief period of prosperity and then began to fall into vice. They grew lazy and luxurious. They forgot their Christian duties. They quarreled among themselves. Their leaders became petty tyrants. And then, he says, came the Troubles. Raids from the Picts in the north, raids from the Scots, who, as we have said, were really Irish raiders from the west. The British leaders sent appeals to Rome, and Rome sent help twice, and the help was effective for a while. But Rome could not keep sending help forever, and so eventually a council was held among the Britons, and a certain leader, whom Gildas calls a proud tyrant, made a fatal decision. He invited the Saxons to come and help defend Britain against the Picts. He gave them land in the east of the island in exchange for military service, and the Saxons came in 3 keys, in 3 long ships, and they fought the Picts, and they were good at it. And then their cousins came, and then their cousins' cousins, and then, finding the food generous and the British weak, they turned on their hosts. They demanded more. They threatened. They burned. They massacred. They swept across the island like a great fire. Gildas says, from sea to sea, burning the cities, throwing down the walls, killing the priests at the altars, hanging the dead bodies of citizens from the broken stones of their own forums. This is the story we have inherited. This is the story that all the later medieval accounts are built on. The proud tyrant, the invited Saxons, the betrayal, the catastrophe. And Gildas does not name the proud tyrant in his text, but later writers working from his account supplied a name. They called him Vortigern. The word itself in Old British simply means High King or Overlord. It is possible that Vortigern was a real personal name, and it is possible that it was a title that came to be remembered as a name, the way the Roman emperors were remembered by their honorifics rather than their birth names. Either way, the figure of Vortigern, the British leader who made the fatal decision to invite the Saxons, has loomed large in British memory ever since. There are places named for him in Wales. There is a hill in Snowdonia called Dennis Emeris, where according to a much later tradition, his fortress was supposed to have stood, and where, according to legend, the young prophet Merlin first revealed his powers by pointing out the 2 dragons sleeping in the pool beneath the foundations. The story has grown elaborate over the centuries. It has been embroidered with magicians and prophecies, and ill-fated marriages, but at its core, even today, sits the version Gildas first told. A British leader, faced with terrible pressures, made a bargain with mercenaries from across the sea, and the bargain went catastrophically wrong. The leaders of the Saxons in the traditional version were 2 brothers named Hengist and Horsa. Hengist means stallion, and Horsa means horse. So we already have a clue that we may be dealing with mythological figures rather than historical ones. The pairing of horse-name brothers as founders is a very common pattern in the Indo-European mythologies of Northern Europe. There are similar pairs in the German tradition, in the Roman tradition, in the Vedic tradition of ancient India. The names smell more of legend than of history. And yet, Hengist and Horsa keep appearing in the early Anglo-Saxon sources as if they had been real. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, compiled centuries later, but drawing on older traditions, places their arrival in the year 449 and says they came at the invitation of Vortigern. They landed in Kent. The Chronicle says, at a place called Iwin Fleot, which is somewhere near modern-day Ebleat. They fought against the Picts, as agreed, and won. Then they sent home for more men, and in time they turned against Vortigern and the Britons, and made themselves the rulers of Kent. Horsa, we are told, was killed in battle somewhere in Kent, perhaps at a place called Alsford. Hengist became the first English king of Kent, the founder of the kingdom that would eventually receive St. Augustine and the first Christian missions from Rome. How much of this is true? Probably some of it. Probably almost none of it. Probably we will never know which parts are which. The general shape of the story, that Germanic warriors were settled in eastern Britain by Roman authorities, that they came in larger numbers over time, that the relationship eventually turned violent, is broadly supported by the archaeology. The specific details, the names, the dates, the speeches, the individual battles, are almost certainly later embroideries, retrojected onto a half-remembered past. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle is recording in the 9th century or later traditions that had been passed down orally for 3 or 4 centuries before anyone wrote them down. By the time those traditions reached parchment, they had been shaped and reshaped by countless retellings around countless fires, and they had become the founding myths of a people who needed founding myths. But Gildas gives us something else, alongside the story of the Saxons. He gives us very briefly the name of a man on the British side, a man whom he praises, almost grudgingly, as a virtuous and effective leader, a man who rallied the Britons after the worst of the Saxon devastation and led them to a great victory. Gildas calls him Ambrosius Aurelianus. The name itself is Roman. Aurelius is one of the great Roman family names. Ambrosius is the Roman version of a Greek word, meaning immortal. This man, if he existed, was a member of the old Romano-British aristocracy, the descendants of the senatorial families who had ruled the province under the empire. Gildas says his parents wore the purple, which was the color of imperial and senatorial authority, and that they perished in the Saxon storm. Ambrosius, however, survived. He gathered the surviving Britons, he fought back, and under his leadership, the Briton won a series of battles, culminating in a great victory at a place that Gildas calls the Siege of Mount Badon, Mons Badonicus, the Battle of Badon Hill. Gildas says this was the year of his own birth, which is one of the very few dates he ever gives us about himself, but he does not tell us when that year was, in any calendar we can convert. The Battle of Badon Hill. This is one of the most famous and most disputed events in all of British history. Almost everything about it is uncertain. We do not know exactly when it happened. We do not know exactly where it happened. We do not know exactly who fought there. Gildas tells us it was a great British victory, a battle so decisive that it stopped the Saxon advance for nearly a generation, perhaps for as long as 40 or 50 years. After Ben, he tells us, there was a period of peace in which the Britons held their land, and the Saxons stayed in their own enclaves in the east, and the great westward push that had been happening slowly came to a halt. But Gildas does not name the British leader at Ben. He does not say it was Ambrosius. He does not say it was anyone else either. He simply says, almost in passing, that the victory happened, that it was important, and that the peace it brought was being squandered by the corrupt and complacent generation that came after. It is into this gap, this nameless, victorious British general at the Battle of Ben Hill, that the figure of King Arthur would eventually be inserted, not by Gildas, who knows no Arthur, not by anyone in the 6th century. The name Arthur does not appear attached to this victory until the 9th century, in a document called the History of the Briton, the Histori Bretonum, traditionally ascribed to a Welsh monk named Nennius. Nennius gives us a list of 12 battles supposedly fought by a war leader named Arthur, of which the 12th is the Battle of Mount Ben. The list is so neat, so symbolic, so suspicious to modern eyes, that historians have argued about it for 2 centuries. Some of the battle sites in the list cannot be identified at all. Some of them seem to be drawn from old Welsh poetry. Some of them appear in other contexts, in other sources, attached to other leaders. The whole list reads less like a historical record and more like a praise poem, the kind of catalogue of victories a bard would sing at a king's table, with each battle name a flourish for the audience to recognize and applaud. And yet the figure of Arthur has refused to die. He has been claimed by generation after generation, by writers and poets and chroniclers, by Welsh and Cornish and Breton and English and French. In the 12th century, a writer named Geoffrey of Monmouth wrote a book called The History of the Kings of Britain, in which he gave Arthur a complete biography with parents named Uther and Igraine, with a sword pulled from a stone, with a court at a place called Callion, with a sorcerer called Merlin, and a queen called Guyenir, and a circle of knights, and a final battle at a place called Camelon, where he was mortally wounded and carried off to the island of Avalon to be healed. Geoffrey of Mouth was by any reasonable standard making most of it up, drawing on snippets of Welsh legend and folklore, and a great deal of his own imagination. But what he wrote became one of the most influential books of the European Middle Ages. From Geoffrey, the Arthur legend spread into French romance, with the addition of figures like Lancelot and the Holy Grail. From the French, it came back into English in works like Sir Thomas Malory's L'Amour d'Arthur in the 15th century. From Malory, it spread into everything we now know about Arthur. All the poems and the paintings and the plays and the films, but strip all of that away. Strip away the round table and the sword and the magicians and the Grail and the Queen and the knights and the wizards. What is left at the very bottom is a single phrase in a single 9th century Welsh document naming a war leader called Arthur as the victor at a battle that Gildas had described 3 centuries before but had not named anyone for. Is that enough to say that Arthur was real? Most modern historians say no. Most modern historians say that if there was a real war leader behind the legend, his name is forever lost, and we have only a literary figure built on top of a half-remembered space in the dark. But others argue that the persistence of the tradition, the fact that the Welsh and the Cornish and the Breton all remembered an Arthur, the fact that the name Arthur appears as a personal name in the early 7th century among the kings of Dalriata in western Scotland, suggesting that someone called Arthur had been famous enough in earlier generations for parents to want to name their sons after him, points to something real underneath. We will not solve this tonight. No one is going to solve it. The mist around Arthur is too thick, and the documents are too few, and the legends have grown too tall around whatever historical seed once existed. What we can say is that somewhere in the late 5th century, in the period after the worst of the Saxon devastations, and before the renewed pressures of the 6th century, the Britain did manage to push back. They did fight a war. They did win some kind of important victory, and in their memory, that victory had a name, and the name became Ben, and the leader at Ben eventually became Arthur, and the figure of Arthur became one of the great myths of Western civilization. From a single sentence in Gildas to all the libraries of the world, that is one of the strangest journeys in all of history. Now, while the legends were forming around figures like Vortigern and Hennist and Arthur, real things were happening on the ground. People were really living. Kingdoms were really being formed. And it is to those kingdoms, the ones that arose in the western and northern parts of Britain in the 5th and 6th centuries, that we should turn next. Because the great mistake that English speakers often make when thinking about this period is to assume that the story is the story of the Anglo-Saxons. The Saxons arrive, the Briton disappear, and then the Saxons gradually fill up the island until they become the English. That is the simple version. That is the version that schoolbooks have often taught. But it is not what really happened. What really happened is that for most of these 4 centuries, half of the island, or more than half, was still ruled by the descendants of the Romano-Briton. They had their own kingdoms, they had their own kings, they had their own bishops, their own armies, their own poets, their own legends. They survived, they flourished in their reduced and changing way, and we know enough about them from a scattering of inscribed stones, from a few surviving Welsh poems, from the occasional reference in continental sources, to give them at least a shadowy outline. To the southwest, in what is now Cornwall and Devon, and parts of Somerset and Dorset, there was the Kingdom of Dumnonia. The name comes from the old British tribe called the Domoni, who had lived in that part of the Jares since before the Romans arrived. After the empire withdrew, Domonia continued to exist as a more or less independent British kingdom ruled by a line of kings whose names survive only fragmentarily. In much later sources, the Dumnonian kings traded with the Mediterranean, as we have already mentioned, exporting tin and importing fine red pottery and amphit. Their main centers seem to have been at hill forts that had been refortified after the Roman withdrawal. The most famous of these is Tintagel, on the rugged north coast of Cornwall, where the cliffs drop straight into the Atlantic, and the wind never quite stops. Tintagel today is most famous as the supposed birthplace of King Arthur, a legend that grew up around the medieval castle that still stands there in ruins. But before the medieval castle, before any legend was attached to the place, Tintagel was a major sub-Roman center. Archaeological excavations there have found hundreds of fragments of imported Mediterranean pottery. The so-called folk red slipware and African red slipware, dating to the 5th and 6th centuries. Tintagel was in its day one of the most important harbors in western Britain, a place where ships from the Byzantine world came in and traded for British tin and other goods. It was a royal site. Whether or not Arthur ever lived there, kings certainly did. Further north, in what we now call Wales, there were several British kingdoms that emerged in this period. There was Gwynedd in the northwest, centered on the mountainous land of Snowonia and the island of Angles. The kings of Gwynedd claimed descent from a figure called Cunedda, who was said to have come down from northern Britain in the late 4th or early 5th century to drive out Irish settlers and establish his line. There was Piss in the east of what is now Wales, sometimes extending into what is now the English Midlands. There was Diept in the southwest, where the influence of Irish settlement was particularly strong, with bilingual inscriptions in Latin and in the Irish Argum script appearing on memorial stones. There was Gwent, and there was Glo Sing in the southeast, which would later combine to form Sharis Morgan Mug, what is now Glorgan. Each of these kingdoms had its own dynasty, its own court, its own internal politics, its own wars with its neighbors. They appear in the genealogies that were eventually written down in Wales in the 10th and 11th tour, centuries in lists of names going back to figures with Roman-style names like Constantine and a Constantine, which was the Welsh form of Maximus, and back beyond them to even more shadowy ancestors. Further north still in the country that the Romans had never fully conquered and that had now fallen out of the empire entirely, there were the British kingdoms of the north. These are the ones whose memory has come down to us most faintly. There was god Odin in the southeast of what is now Scotland, around modern Edinburgh, which the Britons of the time called Dyn Iden. There was Strathclyde in the southwest around the rock of Dumbarton on the Clyde, which they called Alt Clud. There was Reged, somewhere in what is now Cumbria, and possibly parts of Galloway, although its exact extent has never been firmly established. There was Elmet in what is now West Yorkshire, surviving as an independent British kingdom well into the 7th century, longer than any of the others on the eastern side of the country. And there were others, smaller, half-remembered, mentioned once or twice in a poem or a saint's life, and then never again. These were the kingdoms that the Welsh later called the Hen Olled, the Old North. The Briton of those northern lands spoke a language ancestral to modern Welsh, and they remembered themselves even as their kingdoms slowly fell or were absorbed as part of the same Brittonic world that stretched from the Forth down to the tip of Cornwall. When Welsh bards in later centuries sang of the heroes of the Old North, they were singing of their own ancestors. The great poem called Why Godden, attributed to the Bad Anirin, commemorates a doomed warband from Well Fould that rode south to fight the Angles at the Battle of Catra, somewhere in what is now Yorkshire, around the year 600. 300 warriors set out, the poem tells us, and only one returned. They had drunk me for a year in the hall of their king, before riding out, and they fought bravely, and they died. The poem is not history in the modern sense. It is praise poetry, sung in halls in front of patrons who wanted to hear about heroic ancestors. But underneath the heroic frame, it preserves the names and the situations of real people, real kings, real battles, real catastrophes. It is one of the oldest surviving works of literature in any language closely related to Welsh, and it is a window directly into the world we are trying to see. Let us walk for a while among the hill forts. The hill forts are where the archaeology is at its richest, and where you can still today climb up and stand on the ramparts and look out and try to imagine what it was like. Most of the British hill forts had been built long before the Romans arrived. They are our Iron Age constructions, going back to the centuries before the Common Era, when the various British tribes lived in fortified hilltop communities and looked out across their ironatries. When the Romans came, many of these hill forts were abandoned. The Roman authorities preferred their populations down on the plains in the new Roman towns, where they could be more easily taxed and administered. The hill forts went quiet. Grass grew over their ramparts. The wooden palisades rotted and fell. The internal buildings collapsed. For 3 or 4 centuries, most of them slept. And then sometime in the 5th or 6th century, the people came back. The grass was cleared. The ramparts were repaired and heightened. New gates were built, and new walls of dry stone, and new timber halls inside the enclosures. The hill forts were being reused, not as the homes of tribal communities as they had once been, but as the strongholds of the new sub-Roman warlords and kings. At South Cadbury in Somerset, archaeologists in the 1960s excavated a hill fort that turned out to have been extensively refortified in the late 5th and 6th centuries. A great new gatehouse had been built. A massive new rampart had been thrown up, faced with stone, reaching nearly 20 feet high in places. Inside the enclosure, a substantial timber hall had been constructed, with stone footings and a thatched or shingled roof. The site is on a hill in the gentle Somerset countryside, looking out across the levels toward Glastonbury Tor, which rises mysteriously from the flatlands a few miles to the north. It was a major fortress, controlling a significant area of southern Britain in the post-Roman centuries. Local tradition, dating back to at least the 16th century, identified South Cadbury as Camelot, the legendary court of King Arthur. The Tudor antiquary, John Leland, wrote that the local people in his time called the hill Camelot and remembered it as Arthur's place. There is no way to prove or disprove that connection. What we can say is that someone of great power, a king or warlord of considerable resources, was living there in exactly the period that the Arthurian legends point to. Whether his name was Arthur, we will probably never know. But his fortress stood and ate and drank and trained warriors and traded with the Mediterranean and watched over the surrounding country. And eventually, somewhere in the 7th century or the 8th, it fell quiet again, and the grass grew back over the ramparts a second time. At Dinas Pass, in what is now South Wales, just outside Cardiff, another hill fort was reoccupied in the 5th and 6th centuries. This one was smaller, but the archaeology revealed something remarkable. The site had been a center of metalwork production. Workshops on the hilltop had produced fine jewelry, brooches and pins, and decorative fittings in styles that drew on both late Roman and emerging insular Celtic traditions. Imported Mediterranean pottery had been arriving there too, in much the same pattern as at Tintagel, though in smaller quantities. The bones of cattle and sheep and pigs and red deer were scattered through the Wers, was the deposits in numbers that suggested a community of perhaps 50 or 100 people, perhaps a few more, including warriors and craftsmen and servants eating well on the produce, brought up to the hill from the surrounding country. It was probably the seat of a minor king or lord, ruling a piece of what would later be known as Gleorgan. His name we will never know, but for 2 centuries his hill fort hummed with activity. Bronze and silver were melted in his crucibles. Wine from the eastern Mediterranean was drunk in his hall. His warriors slept in timber barracks within his ramparts. And one day, sometime late in the 6th century, or in the 7th, that activity faded too, and the workshops went cold, and the site became once again just a green hill above the streams of the Vale of Glan. At Tintagel, as we have already touched on, the picture was different. Tintagel is not really a hill for in the conventional sense. It is a great rocky headland, almost an island joined to the mainland by a narrow neck of land. The flat top of the headland is acres in extent, and across that flat top in the 5th and 6th centuries, scores of small rectangular stone buildings were constructed. There were probably more than 100 of them. The site has been excavated at intervals over the past century, and each new round of excavation has turned up more buildings, more imports, more evidence of intensive use. The Mediterranean pottery shards at Tintagel number in the thousands. The site was by the standards of post-Roman Western Europe an international port. Ships came in from far away and unloaded their goods and took on Cornish tin and possibly other goods and sailed away again. The wind off the sea would have smelled of salt and of fish and of woodsome smoke from the hearths of Cock, the little stone houses. The British kings, who used Tintagel, perhaps the kings of Dumnonia, perhaps lesser rulers under them, were among the most powerful figures in post-Roman Britain. And when Geoffrey of Monmouth, 6 centuries later, chose Tintagel as the place where King Arthur was born in the romantic tale he invented, he was perhaps, without knowing it, drawing on a much older memory. People had remembered in some dim way that Tintagel had once been an important royal place. The memory had become legend, the legend had become Arthur, and the actual site, the wind-swept headland, sat there all along, with its stone houses and its broken pottery sleeping under the turf, waiting for the spades to come. There were many other hill forts, of course. Dinas Emeris in Snowonia, perched on its rocky knoll above the wooded valley, where excavations have found post-Roman occupation and imported pottery, and where the Vortigern legend later settled. The hill of Castell Henleys in Pembrokeshire, the strange terrace hill of Gan Bodwan on the Lane Peninsula, the promontory fort of Burr Castle in Norfolk, originally one of the Saxon shore forts, possibly reused by sub-Roman authorities, the Crag of Bamber in Northland, where a British fortress called Din Gwaroy stood before it, became the seat of the Anglian kings of Bernia, the mighty rock of Dumbarton in Scotland, Alt Clud, the capital of the British kingdom of Strathclyde, which would survive as an independent power into the 11th century. Each of these places had its own story. Each was occupied, fortified, used by some local king or chieftain or warlord, defended, eventually abandoned or destroyed or taken over. The map of post-Roman Britain, if we could draw it accurately, would be sprinkled all over with these little points of activity, these centers of power like embers from a great scattered fire that had once been the Roman province. Many of those embers eventually died. A few of them caught new fuel and burned brighter, but for the long 5th and 6th centuries, they were what was left. While the British kingdoms held the west and the north, the eastern part of the island was undergoing a transformation that we can see far more clearly in the archaeology than in any written source. The Anglo-Saxon settlement, as historians sometimes politely call it, or the Anglo-Saxon invasion, as it has more dramatically been called, was reshaping the landscape from the coast inwards. In what is now East Anglia, in Lincolnshire, in Yorkshire, in Kent, in Sussex, in the East Midlands, new cemeteries were appearing. These were not Roman cemeteries, they were not Christian cemeteries, they were pagan cemeteries, with the dead buried with weapons, or cremated, and placed in urns, or sometimes inhumed in long rows, oriented in various directions, with brews and beads and combs, and knives, and the occasional fine sword. The grave goods in these cemeteries match in their details the grave goods being deposited in cemeteries in northern Germany and southern Scandinavia in the same centuries. The brooches in the British graves are made in the same styles as the brooches in graves at sites like Feddersen-Var on the German coast, or at sites in Schleswig-Holstein or in southern Jutland. Some of the British graves contain objects that were almost certainly made in the continental homelands and brought across the sea by their owners. Others are local imitations produced by smiths working in the New English communities in the Beak manner of the styles their grandparents had learned in the old country. Either way, the cemeteries tell a clear story. People with strong cultural ties to the lands of northern Europe were now living in eastern Britain in significant numbers, and they were not converting to Christianity, and they were not adopting Romano-British burial customs. They were burying their dead in their own way. How many of them were there? This is one of the great unresolved questions of British history. For a long time, the traditional view was that there had been a massive migration. Tens of thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands of Saxons and Angles and Jutes had crossed the North Sea and overrun the lands of Britain, displacing or killing or enslaving the existing population. The British, in this view, had either fled westward into Wales and Cornwall and across the sea to Brittany, or had been wiped out, or had been reduced to a serf class in the New English society. This was the view of most 19th-century historians. It fit the narrative of conquest and replacement that the Victorian imagination found attractive, and it seemed to be supported by the apparent completeness of the linguistic change. The English language is a Germanic language, descended from the speech of those very Saxons and Angles. It contains very few words that can be traced back to the British language. There is no obvious British substrate the way there is, for example, a Celtic substrate in French. If the British population had remained, the argument went, surely some of their words and grammar would have survived into the New English. The fact that almost none did suggested that the population itself had not survived in any significant numbers. But the picture has grown much more complicated in recent decades, especially since the rise of genetic analysis and the more careful re-examination of the archaeology. The grave goods that look so Germanic might have been adopted by Britons who wish to align themselves with the new ruling group. Cultural assimilation can run in either direction. There are well-documented examples from other periods and places where a small but powerful incoming group has transformed the culture of a much larger native population without large-scale population replacement. The Normans in 11th century England are a good example. After 1066, the language of the elite became French, the architecture became Norman, the laws became Norman, and yet the great mass of the English population remained English. If we only had archaeology and no written records, we might guess that England had been depopulated and replaced by Normans in the 11th century, which we know it was not. Could something similar have happened in the 5th and 6th centuries? Could a relatively small Anglo-Saxon ruling class have come over, established control of the lowlands, imposed their language and customs over time, while the bulk of the population remained the descendants of the Romano-British? Some historians now think this is exactly what happened. Others still believe in a larger migration. The genetic evidence has been argued in both directions, and the analysis depends a great deal on which DNA you are looking at, and from when, and from where, and how you interpret it. What we can say is this. The recent ancient DNA studies, which extract genetic material directly from the bones of people who lived in this period and compare it to other populations, suggest that there was a substantial migration into eastern England, not a total replacement. The native British population did not disappear genetically, but there was a real influx, especially into the eastern parts of the country, and especially in the 5th and 6th centuries. The mixing was uneven, with more incomers in some places, more natives in others. By the time the first English kingdoms emerge into clearer historical view in the 7th century, The population of what would become England was a blend with significant contributions from both groups. The cultural face of that blend, the language and the customs and the names, was Anglo-Saxon. The blood was mixed. The story was not as simple as conquest and replacement, and it was not as simple as elite takeover. It was both and neither, and something in between, with regional variations that we may never fully untangle. The language change is still the strangest thing. Even if there was substantial migration, it remains surprising that almost no British vocabulary survived into Old English. The few words that have been claimed as British substrate, things like brock for badger or come for a small valley, are debated. Place names tell a slightly different story. The names of the rivers, in particular, are heavily British. The Thames, and the Trent, and the Severn, and the Arn, and the Tyne, and the Tees, and the Mersey, and the Wye, and many others, all have names that go back to pre-English forms. Arn in particular is simply the British word for river. Whoever told the incoming Anglo-Saxons that the river was called Avon was a British speaker, and the new arrivals took the name and used it without quite realizing that they were using a common noun rather than a proper name. The same is true of many smaller geographical features. Hills, ridges, woods, sometimes whole districts retained their old British names, even as the language of the people living there shifted. The names are like fossils in the stratigraphy of the landscape, pieces of an older world preserved in the speech of the new one. So someone was still speaking British, at least for long enough to teach the names to the newcomers. The two languages must have coexisted in some places for some generations before the older one finally died out. There is another factor that we should pause on for a moment, because it is one of the most haunting and least appreciated aspects of this whole period: the climate. In the spring of the year 536, something extraordinary happened in the sky. Across the whole northern hemisphere, the sun grew dim, a veil of haze, faint to begin with, but soon thick enough that people noticed, hung over Europe and Asia for more than a year. Crops failed. Summers were cold. There was snow in August in some places. The historian Prupius, writing in Constantinople, reported that the sun gave its light without brightness like the moon, and that men were in fear. The Irish Chronicles reported a failure of bread in the year 536. The Chinese Annals reported drought and famine. The tree rings of that year, in oaks and pines, all around the northern hemisphere, are stunted and narrow, recording a single bad summer like a thin pale line in the wood. We now know from analysis of ice cores from Greenland and Antarctica that a major volcanic eruption took place in the year 536, possibly in Iceland, possibly in Central America, possibly two eruptions close together. Vast quantities of sulfur and ash were thrown into the stratosphere, where they spread around the globe and dimmed the sun for years. And then, just as the world was beginning to recover, in the year 540, there was another eruption, possibly in the same volcano, or possibly in another one, and the dimming and the cold returned. The decade of the 540s was the coldest decade in 2,000 years. People starved, communities collapsed, and for a population that was already weakened by war and by upheaval, the strain was almost unbearable. And then on top of all of that came the plague, the Justinianic plague, we now call it, named after the Byzantine Emperor Justinian, in whose reign it first broke out in the eastern Mediterranean in the early 540s. It was the first major pandemic of bubonic plague in recorded history, the same disease that would later become the Black Death of the 14th century. It started, the records suggest, somewhere in Central Africa, and traveled up to Egypt, and then, by ship to Constantinople, where Procopius described it in horrifying detail. From Constantinople, it spread across the empire and beyond. It reached the British Isles by the middle of the 6th century. Adaman, the Irish abbot of Iona, writing later in the 7th century, mentions that the plague reached Ireland in the year 544. From Ireland, it may have spread to western Britain. Some scholars have suggested that the plague disproportionately affected the Romano-British populations who were still connected by sea trade to the Mediterranean and the continent, while the Anglo-Saxon populations of eastern Britain, who were less tightly woven into those trading networks, were less affected. If this is true, it would help explain how the balance of power in Britain shifted so dramatically in the late 6th century. The British kingdoms, which had held their ground after Ben, began to lose it again. The Anglo-Saxons began to push westward once more. By the year 577, according to the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, 3 British cities, Gloucester and Caicester and Bath, fell to the West Saxons at the Battle of Durham. The British kingdom that had controlled that area, whatever it had been called, collapsed. The path to the Bristol Channel was opened. The Britain of the southwest were cut off from the Britain of Wales by a wedge of New English territory. The world of Mediterranean trade, which had kept Tintagel and Dinas Pace and South Cadbury flourishing, began to dwindle. The pottery imports tail off in the archaeological record around the same time. By the end of the 6th century, the connection across the sea to the eastern Mediterranean had effectively closed. The British West was on its own. Out of the changing land in the late 6th and early 7th centuries, the first true English kingdoms began to emerge into something resembling the historical light. We can see them now dimly, like figures in a fog that is just beginning to lift. There were many of them, smaller than the kingdoms we usually name, sometimes called the Heptarchy when historians want to give the period a tidy shape, although in reality there were never exactly 7, and the number rose and fell. There was Kent in the southeast corner, the oldest of them, ruled by the line that traced itself back to Hang with its capital at Canterbury. There was Sussex, the kingdom of the South Saxons. Between the Weald and the sea, there was Wessex, the kingdom of the West Saxons, which began as a small enclave in the upper Tempame valley and gradually spread southward and westward across central southern Britain. There was Essex, the kingdom of the East Saxons, in what is now Essex, and parts of Hertfordshire and Middlesex, including the abandoned ruins of Londinium. There was East Anglia, divided into the regions called Norfolk and Suffolk. The North folk and the South folk of the East Angles ruled from royal centres like Rendlesham and probably others. There was Mercia in the middle of the country, originally the kingdom of the Anglian peoples of the Trent Valley, which would in time grow to dominate most of the Midlands and become for a while the most powerful kingdom in Britain. And there was Northumbria in the north, which itself was originally 2 kingdoms, Bernicia in the north and Dera in the south, that were combined and recombined under various kings, and that together stretched from the Humber up to the 5th of Forth. There were also smaller kingdoms that appear in the records and then vanish, swallowed by their bigger neighbours. There was Lindsey, around modern Lincoln. There was Huici, in what is now Warwickshire and Gloucestershire, and parts of Warwickshire, ruled by a sub-king under the kings of Mercia. There was Mageta on the Welsh border. There was the Middle Anglian kingdom of the Ecklingus before it was absorbed into Mere. There were probably others whose names have been entirely lost. The picture is not one of its tidy heptarchy, but of a constantly shifting patchwork of small polities with kings rising and falling, alliances forming and breaking, territories being won and lost, royal houses dying out and being replaced. It was very much like the political world of the British kingdoms to the west, which was also a patchwork of changing alliances and shifting borders. The difference was that the eastern kingdoms were now English in language and culture, while the western kingdoms remained British, and the line between them, the long boundary running roughly north and south through the middle of the island, was where the wars were fought. The most powerful king of the early 7th century, the first king for whom we have something like a serious biography, was Athelbert of Kent. He was the great-great-great-great-grandson in the official genealogy of Hunganist. He ruled Kent from somewhere around the year 580 until his death in 616, which is a long reign for any age, but particularly for this one. He was a pagan in a kingdom that was still largely pagan, but he had married a Christian princess named Bertha, the daughter of a Frankish king from across the Channel. She had brought with her a Christian chaplain named Ludhard, and she had been allowed to continue practicing her faith in a small church just outside Canterbury that had been built in Roman times and was still standing. That church, dedicated to Saint Martin of Tours, is still there. It is the oldest church in England that has been in continuous use as a place of Christian worship. Its walls contain Roman brickwork from the original construction, 16 centuries old, set into the masonry by Burr's craftsmen, and never since demolished. You can still go and visit it, you can still stand inside and look at the walls, and know that you are standing in the same space, where the Queen of Kent prayed in the years before St. Augustine arrived, and it was to Albert and his court that St. Augustine and his fellow monks came in the year 597, sent from Rome by Pope Gregory the Great, to bring Christianity to the English. The Venerable Bede, writing more than a century later, tells the story in his ecclesiastical History of the English People, which is one of the great works of early medieval literature, and our single most important source for everything that happens in England from the late 6th century onwards. According to Bede, Augustine landed on the Isle of Thanet on the coast of Kent, with a band of about 40 companions. They were nervous. They had heard frightening stories about the ferocity of the English. They had nearly turned back several times on their journey through Gaul, but they came on, and they landed, and they sent word to King Athelbert that they had come from Rome with good news. Athelbert, with the caution of a man who had been told that wizards might bewitch him with their incantations, insisted that the first meeting take place out of doors, where no spells could be safely cast. So Augustine and his monks walked out to meet him in a field on Thanet. They came in procession, carrying a silver cross and a painted board with the image of Christ, singing their Latin chants in voices that must have sounded to Kentish ears very strange indeed. Aelbert listened. He did not promise to convert. He did promise that they could come into his kingdom and preach freely, and he gave them a house in Canterbury, the old Roman capital of the kingdom, where they could live and pray. And there they began to build slowly the foundations of what would eventually become the English Church. Within a year, Athelbert himself was baptized. Within a generation, his kingdom was officially Christian, even if the deep practice of the old faith continued in many homes for much longer. The conversion of the rest of England took the better part of the 7th century, and it did not happen in a single straight line. Kings converted, and then their sons reverted to paganism. Kingdoms received missionaries, and then expelled them. Bishops were appointed, and then driven out. The work was slow and difficult, and uneven, but the long arc bent in one direction. By the end of the 7th century, all the major English kingdoms had officially adopted Christianity, although the missions that converted them had come from different directions. Kent and the south had been converted by missionaries from Rome working out of Canterbury. The kingdoms of the north had been converted for the most part by missionaries from the Irish Church working out of the monastery of Iona on its small green island off the western coast of Jocks, Scotland. Iona had been founded by Saint Columba, an Irish prince turned monk in the year 563, and had become the spiritual center of a network of Celtic Christianity that reached across the western British and Irish worlds. From Iona, the monks went east. Aidan, one of those monks, was invited by King Oswald of Northumbria in the 630s to come and convert his people. Aidan came and established a monastery on the tidal island of Lindisfarne off the northeast coast of England, which became known as the Holy Island. From Lindisfarne, the Irish style of Christianity spread across Northumbria and down into the Midlands, encountering eventually the Roman style of Christianity coming up from the south. The two styles had different ways of calculating the date of Easter. different ways of cutting the hair of monks, different ideas about church organization. They came into conflict. The matter was resolved, after much argument, at a great gathering called the Synod of Whitby, in May the year 664. King Ofvu of Northumbria, who presided, ruled in favor of the Roman style. And so the English Church, even in its northernmost reaches, became aligned with Rome and with the rest of Western European Christianity, rather than with the Celtic traditions of Ireland and Western Britain. These details may seem dry, but they are some of the only firm facts we have for the 7th century, and they are the foundation stones on which all later English history is built. The conversion of England to Christianity is the event that fully ended the British Dark Age, because the Church brought with it literacy and Latin learning and the habits of writing things down. Before the missionaries came, almost no one in the English kingdoms could write. The runic alphabet was used for short inscriptions on objects, on coins, on memorial stones. But there was no tradition of writing long texts in Old English. The monks brought parchment and ink, and the Latin alphabet, and the practice of recording the tickins, deeds of kings and bishops in chronicles and saints' lives. From the moment they arrived, the silence of the long dark age began to lift. We start to have charters dated and signed. We start to have laws written down by order of kings like Athelbert, who issued the first English law code in the early 7th century. We start to have letters between bishops and abbots and kings, some of which survive. We start to have the works of scholars in Latin, and eventually in English, that allow us to see the world they lived in directly through their own eyes. The greatest of these scholars was the Venerable Bede. He was born around the year 673 in Northumbria, and he was given to the monastery of Monmouth as a small child of 7 to be raised as a monk. He spent his entire life in the twin monasteries of Monk and Jarrow, which were among the most important centers of learning in early Christian England. He never traveled far. He never sought public office. He worked day after day, year after year, in the scriptorum and the library, reading every book he could lay his hands on, writing, copying, teaching, and praying. He wrote works on grammar, on metrics, on the calculation of the date of Easter, on the lives of saints, on biblical interpretation, and he wrote one great work that has come down to us as the foundation of English historical knowledge, the Ecclesiastical History of the English People, completed in the year 731, just 4 years before his death. In it, Bede told the story of how the English had come to Britain, how they had been converted to Christianity, how the church had been organized, and what kings and bishops and saints had been important along the way. He drew on every source he could find. He wrote to friends and contacts at other monasteries, asking them to send him any documents they had. He went carefully through the records of his own monastery. He recorded oral traditions when he had them. He cited his sources in a way that was extremely unusual for a writer of his time. He made mistakes, of course, especially when dealing with the centuries before living memory. He had biases, especially in favor of his own monastery and against those who disagreed with the Roman style of Christianity. But he was a careful, honest, intelligent writer, and his book is the closest thing we have to a clear window into the 7th century. Without Bede, we would know almost nothing. Without Bede, the Dark Age might have stretched another century longer. It is to Bede that we owe many of the details we have about the events of the conversion. The story of Augustine's arrival in Kent, the meetings with Athelbert, the missions of Paulinus to Northumbria, the dramatic conversion of King Edwin of Northumbria, in the year 627, with all its famous details, including the speech of the unnamed counsellor, comparing human life to the flight of a sparrow through a lighted hall in winter, a moment of brightness between two unknown darknesses. All of these come from Bede. The dramatic battles of Northumbria against Mercia, the deaths of King Edwin and King Oswald in battle against the pagan, Mercian King Penda, the great victory of King Oswu over Penda, at the Battle of the Wind in 655, after which Northumbria became the dominant kingdom in Britain for a time. All of these we know from Bate. He gave us the figures, he gave us the dates, he gave us the speeches. He gave us the names of the men who fought, and the women who founded monasteries, and the kings who made decisions that shaped the future of an island. He even gave us the convention of dating events from the birth of Christ, the anodymony system, which he popularized in his historical writing, and which has been used in the Western world ever since. When you say a year is 2026, you are using a system Bede helped invent. He was an extraordinary man, working in difficult times, doing patient, careful work that has shaped how we understand his world. But even Bede did not really know what had happened in the 5th century. He had no good sources for it. He knew what Gildas had written, which he summarized. He knew the basic story of Hengist and Horsa and the Adventus Saxonum, which he recorded. He knew the names of some of the kings of his own kingdoms, distant past, which he listed in genealogies. But the details, the texture, the daily life of the 5th and 6th centuries were as obscure to Correndum and the early 8th century as they remain to us today. He was already looking back across the Dark Age. He could see the shadows, but not the shapes within them. And he wrote what he could, and admitted what he did not know, and trusted that future readers would understand. By the time Bede was writing in the early 8th century, the world he lived in was solidly Christian and largely literate, at least among the educated elite. The kingdoms of the English had taken on a more stable shape. Mere under a series of strong kings was emerging as the dominant power in the Midlands. Wessex was beginning the long process of expansion that would eventually make it the foundation of a united English kingdom. Northumbria, after its 7th century golden age, was beginning to decline politically, though it remained for a long time a major center of scholarship and art. The great illuminated gospel books, the Lindisfarne Gospels, and the Book of Kells were being produced in the monasteries of the British and Irish worlds, with their intricate, interlaced designs drawing on both Mediterranean Christian and native Celtic artistic traditions. The English language itself was beginning to settle into the form we call Old English, and the first surviving examples of Old English poetry were being composed, including the great heroic poem Beowulf, whose date of composition is still debated, but whose roots stretch back into the world of the early Anglo-Saxon migrations. In the British West, meanwhile, the Dark Age was longer and the recovery slower. The Welsh kingdoms continued through the 7th and 8th centuries, fighting their wars with the English, especially with the kings of Mercia. They had their own bards and their own chroniclers, but their writings have mostly come down to us only in much later copies. The great poem We Egodin, which we mentioned earlier, was probably composed in the late 6th or early 7th century, but the version we have is in a manuscript from the 13th century. The Mabinogon, that strange cycle of Welsh prose tales that preserves stories going back into the deepest British past, was first written down in the 11th or 12th century in manuscripts that survived only by chance. The chronicles of the Welsh princes, the genealogies of the Welsh royal houses, the annals of the Welsh kingdoms, all of these were maintained, but they were maintained in a smaller world, with fewer resources, in a language that the wider European audience could not read. And so while the English world of Bede and his successors comes through to us in relatively clear sound, the British world of the same period comes through more faintly, like a song heard from a long way off, in a language you almost but not quite understand. The kingdom of Strathclyde, in the far north, survived longer than any of the others. It held the rock of Dumbarton, with its commanding position over the Clyde, until the rock was finally sacked by Vikings in the year 870. Even after that, the kingdom continued in reduced form until it was finally absorbed into the Liffingshire Kingdom of Scotland in the 11th century. Its kings spoke a language descended from Old British, closer to Welsh than to modern Scottish Gaelic, and they remembered in their poems and their genealogies that they were heirs to the world of post-Roman Britain. They were the last living link in some sense to the world of Gildas and Ambrosius and the unnamed war leader who had fought at Mount Ben. Let us slow down for a moment and try to picture as best we can what life actually looked like in the dark centuries themselves. Not the politics, not the kings, not the battles, just the daily texture of being alive in Britain between, say, the year 450 and the year 650. What did people eat? Where did they sleep? What did they hear when they woke up in the morning? What did they fear when the sun went down? The first thing to understand is that for most people, in most places, life had always been agricultural and remained agricultural through every change of language and religion and ruler. The vast majority of the population lived in small farming settlements, growing wheat and barley and oats and rye, keeping cattle and sheep and pigs and chickens and geese, working the same fields their grandparents had worked, observing the same seasons, fearing the same diseases, hoping for the same kinds of weather. The collapse of the Roman administrative system did not change any of this in its fundamentals. What it changed was the wider context. Under the empire, the farmers' produce had been taxed, and the taxes had supported soldiers and roads and cities, and a whole class of officials. But the farmer himself had been left to his ploughing. After the empire, the farmer's produce was no longer being taxed by an imperial system. It was instead being taken in smaller and more direct forms by local lords, or by churches, or by the demands of nearby warbands. The relationships became more personal and more local. The world a farmer dealt with shrank to the size he could walk in a day. The villages where these farmers lived have left their traces in the archaeology of post-Roman Britain. They were typically small clusters of buildings, perhaps 5 or 10 or 20 households, arranged loosely, without the rigid Roman grid. Their houses were timber-framed and thatched with wool and daub walls, with a hearth in the middle of the main room, with smoke escaping through the roof or through small openings under the eaves. The inside of such a house would have been smoky, dim, and surprisingly warm in winter, especially with the cattle penned in the same building or in a connected byre on cold nights. The light was firelight and oil lamps, and the slanting light through narrow doorways and windows. The walls were hung with woven cloth and tools and weapons. The floor was hardened earth, sometimes covered with rushes or straw that were swept out and replaced regularly. Children sat by the hearth. Old women spun thread on hand spindles. The work was constant and quiet, and known to every hand that did it, from years of repetition. The fields around these villages were ploughed with ox teams in long, thin strips, with each family farming several scattered strips in different parts of the village's land. This pattern of agriculture, which would eventually develop into the medieval open field system, was beginning to take shape in the post-Roman centuries. It replaced in many areas the more enclosed and more individualized farming patterns of the Roman period. When villa estates had worked larger blocks of land with slave or tenant labor, the post-Roman peasant farmed in cooperation with his neighbors, sharing oxen and plows and labor at harvest, attending the common decisions of the village in the way that small farming communities have always done. He owed dues in produce and in labor to whoever the local lord was. The local lord might be a Saxon then in the east. He might be a British king or sub-king in the west. He might be the abbot of a nearby monastery after the conversion. The Jews were broadly similar in kind. Whoever was at the top, a portion of the grain, a portion of the meat, days of work on the Lord's own fields, help in the Lord's wars if he asked for it. The basic shape of rural life was set, and it would remain in roughly this shape with slow changes for the next 1,000 years. The towns, meanwhile, were largely empty. This is one of the most striking things about post-Roman Britain compared to post-Roman Gaul or Spain or Italy. In those other parts of the Western Empire, the Roman cities mostly survived. They shrank, they changed, they sometimes lost their old administrative functions, but they continued as inhabited urban centers. The cathedrals of medieval France and Spain stand inside the walls of Roman towns, whose continuity has never really been broken. In Britain, by contrast, most of the Roman towns were essentially abandoned. Within a century or two of the Roman withdrawal, the great cities like Roxett and Silchester, and Verulam and Questor, and many others were quiet. People still lived in some of them, in small numbers, in cottages built among the ruins. But the urban life that had once filled their streets was gone. The forums were grass-grown, the basilas were rubble, the amphitheaters where they had existed became sheep pastures. The water systems failed, the drains backed up, the streets disappeared under accumulating mud and weeds. We do not really know why British towns failed so completely when continental towns generally survived. There are several theories. One is that British urbanism had always been shallower, less rooted in deep traditions, more dependent on the active presence of Roman administration. When the administration left, the underpinnings of urban life simply collapsed. Another theory is that the disruption in Britain was much more violent than on the continent, with Anglo-Saxon settlers actively avoiding the old towns and choosing to live elsewhere onto other landscape, leaving the urban centers to decay. A third theory is that the plague and the climate disasters of the 6th century hit the towns particularly hard, since their dense populations made them more vulnerable to disease, while the rural populations recovered more easily. A fourth theory is that all of these factors combined in ways we cannot fully untangle. Whatever the cause, the result is striking. When you walk through the modern English landscape, the Roman cities are often visible as crop, marks in fields, or as low earthworks in pastureland, or as bumps under the grass of country parks. They are ghostly, they are quiet, they are not for the most part under our living modern cities. They are next to them, or under fields, or under sleepy market towns that grew up on different sites in the medieval period. The continuity of urban life that you find in France or in Italy is in Britain almost entirely absent. Only a handful of Roman cities, like London, like York, like Lincoln, like Canterbury, like Carlisle, like Chester, maintained any meaningful continuity through the dark centuries. And even those were greatly reduced before they began to grow again in the later Saxon period. The roads, as we have said, remained. The Roman roads of Britain were too well built to disappear, even if many of them fell out of regular maintenance and gradually deteriorated. People walked them, weavers used them to move cattle, pilgrims in time walked them to shrines. Soldiers, when armies marched, used them whenever they could. The shape of the modern English road network still reflects in many places the network the Sporrian Romans had laid down. When you drive on the A1 in northern England, you are following the line of the Old Man Street. When you drive on parts of the A5, you are following the line-in of Watling Street. When you cross from Dover to Canterbury to London, you are tracing the route the legions used, the route Augustine and his monks used, the route 1,000 pilgrims later used to visit the shrine of St. Thomas Becket. The roads outlived the empire that built them. They outlived the kingdom that built the cathedrals. They outlived the Reformation and the Civil War and the Industrial Revolution. They will probably outlive us too. While the towns were emptying and the roads were waiting, the church was quietly becoming the new framework for life in much of Britain, at least in the British West, and after the conversions of the 7th century, in the New English East as well. The story of British Christianity in this period is one of the most interesting and least well-known parts of the Dark Age. We have already mentioned Patrick, the British Christian who became the Apostle of Ireland. He was not unique. There were many other British missionaries and saints whose lives are recorded in much later hagiographies, but whose work belongs to the 5th and 6th centuries. St. Illtyd, the founder of the great monastery and school of Llantwit Major in South Wales, where many her later Welsh saints were said to have been educated. David, the patron saint of Wales, who lived in the 6th century and founded the monastery that is now the cathedral city of St. David's in Pembrokeshire. St. Cadoc, the founder of the monastery at Lindisfarne. St. Samson, who later travelled across to Brittany and helped found the Breton Church. St. Petro, who worked in Cornwall and whose name still appears on dozens of Cornish churches and villages. St. Piran, also of Cornwall, traditionally said to have crossed from Ireland on a millstone, who became the patron saint of Cornish tin miners. St. Bridget, the great Irish saint whose cult crossed the sea to influence British Christianity. St. Columba, who left Ireland to found Iona. St. Columbanus, who left Ireland to found monasteries in Frankish Gaul and northern Italy. The list is long, and most of the names are unfamiliar to anyone who has not specifically studied this period, but the pattern they form is striking. Across the Western British and Irish worlds, in the deepest of the dark centuries, a vigorous and creative Christian culture was developing. It produced saints, whose memory has lasted 1,500 years. It produced monasteries that became centers of learning. It produced an art and a literature that has survived in fragments in some of the most beautiful manuscripts of the early medieval world. The British Christian culture of this period had its own particular flavor. The monasteries were sometimes large, sometimes small. They were often built in remote and beautiful places, on islands or in mountain valleys, or on rocky headlands by the sea. They emphasized a particularly strict and aesthetic kind of monastic life, drawing on the traditions of the desert fathers of Egypt and Syria, who had become famous in the most eastern Mediterranean in the 4th century, and whose example had spread throughout the Christian world. British and Irish monks went out alone to live in remote hermitages on bare rocky islands in tiny, stone cells called clans, where they prayed and meditated and lived on almost nothing. The most famous example is the monastery of Skellig Michael on a precipitous pyramid of rock, 8 miles off the coast of Kerry in Ireland, where for centuries monks lived in dry stone beehive cells at the top of dizzying flights of stone steps, far above the sea, with the wind and the gannets, and the grey Atlantic, for their only company. There were similar sites all along the western coasts of Britain and Ireland. The Hermitage on the island of Cal, off the Pembrokeshire coast, the Hermitage on Bardsey Island, off the tip of the Lane Peninsula, the Hermitages of the Inner Heads, the Monastery of Whithorn in southwest Scotland, traditionally founded by S. Stinian in the early 5th century, possibly the earliest Christian foundation in what is now Scotland. The Monastery of Glastonbury in the marshes of Somerset, which is one of the oldest in Britain, although the legends attached to it are largely later inventions. The Monastery of Bangor Iscode in North Wales, which according to Bede had 2,000 monks at the time of its destruction by an English king in the early 7th century. A figure that sounds incredible but suggests something of the scale of British monastic Christianity at its height. The monks of Bangor Iscode prayed for the British army before a battle at Chester around the year 615, and were massacred almost to a man by the victorious English. It was in its time one of the largest atrocities of the period, although it is barely remembered outside specialist works today. The inscriptions on stone that survived from this period are some of our most evocative direct contacts with the people who lived through it. Across western Britain from Cornwall, up through Wales, and into northern England and southern Scotland, there are surviving memorial stones from the 5th and 6th and 7th centuries, with inscriptions in Latin, sometimes in Ogham, sometimes in both. They mark the graves or the memorials of important people whose names would otherwise be entirely lost. There is the famous stone at Llan Leonfell in Paris, marking the burial of a man called Ior. There is the Cuneric stone at Rocks, found near the old Roman city, naming a man whose name is Irish, suggesting an Irish settler buried in the city in the post-Roman period. There is the famous Pillar of Elis in North Wales, a tall stone shaft erected in the 9th century, but commemorating a king named Elis of Pise, who had lived in the 8th, with a long inscription that included a genealogy reaching back. The inscription claimed to Vortigern and to the Emperor Magnus Maximus and beyond. There is the stone at St. Justin Cornwall, with its bilingual Latin and Augam inscription. There is the stone at Pen Macno in Snowonia, marking the grave of a man called Croesus, with the simple Latin words, "In hot congeries laidum." In this heap of stones he lies. There is the stone at Llanfair Waterdine in Shropshire, originally an ancient memorial, later set up at the door of a parish church. There are dozens, perhaps hundreds of these stones, scattered across the western British landscape, weathered and lichen-patched, often broken or moved from their original sites, but still legible if you know how to look. Each stone is a small individual voice from the Dark Age, naming a single person who once lived, who once was loved enough that someone went to the trouble of having a stone cut and carved and set up in their memory. The names are British, the names are Irish, the names are occasionally Latin. Sometimes the inscriptions include the rank of the dead. He was a king, he was a soldier, he was a magistrate, he was a priest, he was the son of so-and-so, who was the son of so-and-so before him. Sometimes the inscriptions include a Christian prayer or formula. May he rest in peace. May his soul be in joy. Sometimes the inscriptions are too weathered to read, and we are left only with the bare fact of the stone itself, that someone once stood here in some lost valley 1500 years ago, and watched as the mason carved a memorial in a language they understood, and a faith they shared, and walked home afterwards along a path that no one remembers, and slept under a roof that no longer stands. The world of the post-Roman warlords and kings, the world we have been moving through, was a world that was very different from the world we live in now in obvious ways, but it was also a world that contained the seeds of everything that came after. The kings who fought in the 5th and 6th centuries were the ancestors of the kings who fought in the 11th and the 12th. The monasteries that were founded in the 5th and 6th centuries were the ancestors of the kings, dioeches, abbeys of the High Middle Ages. The poetry that was composed in the 5th and 6th centuries in the halls of British and English kings was the ancestor of the poetry that English speakers still read and English speakers still write. The land itself, the green country with its hills and rivers and woodlands, was the same land we walk in today. If you climb to the top of South Cadbury and look out across Somerset on a clear day, you are seeing a view that has barely changed in 1500 years. The villages have moved a little. The trees have grown and been cut and grown again, but the shapes of the hills are the same. The light on the levels is the same. The hawks circling over the fields are the descendants of the hawks that circled when the loud warlords of the British West held that hill against the rising tide of the English. The world we inherit is layered on top of all those older worlds, like a palimpsest, like a tapestry woven over and over again with different threads but on the same loom. And the people who lived through the Dark Age were in their essential humanity the same as we are. They loved their children, they mourned their dead, they argued with their neighbors, they worked hard and slept tired, they worried about the weather and the harvest and the health of their cattle. They told stories around their hearths in the long winter evenings, stories of their ancestors and of strange events, and of heroes and of monsters, stories that were sometimes true and sometimes were not, and were sometimes a mixture of both. They sang, they prayed, they quarreled, they reconciled, they got drunk on feast days and laughed too loud, and woke up the next morning with sore heads and sheepish grins. They were not strangers, not really. They were us, in different clothes, in a different language, under a different sky, that was nevertheless the same sky. And when we try to understand them, even across the deep silence of 1500 years, we are doing something that they themselves did. We are trying to remember. We are trying to make sense of a past that has slipped most of the way into the dark. We are trying to keep in our own small, flickering way the names alive. There are a few moments in the Dark Age when by accident or by luck the silence breaks and we catch a sudden, vivid glimpse of the world as it was. One of these moments came in the spring of 1939 on a sandy ridge above the River Dibon in Suffolk, when an amateur archaeologist named Basil Brown, working at the request of a landowner named Edith Pretty, began to dig into a series of low, grass-covered mounds at a place called Sutton. The mounds had been there for centuries. Local people had wondered about them. Some had been disturbed by treasure hunters in the past, with little to show for it. But the largest mound, when Brown began to dig into it, turned out to contain something extraordinary. There were the shadows of timbers in the sand. The shadows formed the shape of a ship, a great ship, 90 feet long, that had been hauled up from the river and buried whole as a tomb, with its dead chieftain laid inside it among an unimaginable wealth of treasures. The wood of the ship had long since rotted away. Only its impression remained in the sand, like a photograph in dust. But in the burial chamber amidships, the objects had survived. There was a helmet in fragments with iron faceplate and bronze ornament, the famous helmet that has become almost the symbol of Anglo-Saxon England with its eye sockets and its menacing dragon-shaped nosepiece. There was a great gold belt buckle, weighing more than a pound, carved with the writhing, interlaced beasts of the early Germanic art style. There were shoulder clasps of gold and garnet set with the deep red stones from Sri Lanka in cellwork of astonishing precision. There was a sword in its decorated scabbard. There was a shield with its iron boss and its decorative mounts. There were silver bowls from the Eastern Roman Empire with the stamps of Byzantine emperors on grès. Their bases, showing that they had been made in Constantinople in the late 6th century and had somehow travelled across the whole of Europe to end up buried in an English ship in Suffolk. There were gold coins from the Frankish kingdoms across the Channel, neatly arranged in a purse, with 37 of them inside, each from a different mint, almost like a sampler. There were drinking horns with their silver mounts. There was a great cauldron hung on a chain. There was a stringed instrument, a lyre in pieces. There were textiles in small surviving fragments, showing rich decoration. There were spears, and there were arrows, and there were the remains of a magnificent ceremonial whetstone or scepter, topped with the figure of a stag. Everything spoke of immense wealth of cosmopolitan connections, of a king who had ruled a real kingdom, and who had been honored in death with everything his court could give him. The Sutton Hoo burial was almost certainly the grave of King Raedwald of East Anglia, who died around the year 624 or 625, although other identifications have been proposed. Raedwald is a name we know from Bede. He had been baptized as a Christian under the influence of Ethelbert of Kent, but according to Bede, he had also kept up the old pagan rites, maintaining altars to both the Christian god and the old gods in the same temple. The ship burial at Sutton Hoo has been understood by many scholars as a perfect symbolic representation of this religious ambivalence. The burial mound and the ship and the grave goods are pagan in their basic conception, drawing on the same world of Germanic heroic ritual that we see described in the poem Beowulf. But the silver bowls and spoons among the treasures, with their crosses and their Greek inscriptions, are Christian. The dead king had one foot in each world. He was buried with the wealth of an emperor and the symbols of two religions in a great ship, pointing the way to the next life, and his treasures were covered over with sand, and the mound was raised, and the world went on without him. The discovery of Sutton, who in 1939, just months before the outbreak of the Second World War, transformed how we think about early Anglo-Saxon England. The old idea that the Anglo-Saxons of the 6th and early 7th centuries had been simple, rough, illiterate barbarians, sitting in smoky timber halls drinking beer, was suddenly very hard to maintain. Anyone who could be buried with that much wealth, that much craftsmanship, those Byzantine, silver bowls and Frankish gold coins, and Sri Lankan garnets, was not living in a backward little world. He was at the center of a network of trade and gift exchange that stretched across the whole of Europe and beyond. He had his own court poet to compose praise songs and lamentations. He had his own goldsmiths, and his own armorers, and his own shipbuilders. He had connections to other kings in Frankish Gaul, and in Kent, and in Northumbria, and probably further afield. He had wealth, he had power, he had in his own dim corner of the Dark Age a kind of brilliance that we are only just beginning to pry to. The Cleave, and he is not alone. Other rich Anglo-Saxon burials have come to light over the years, though none on quite the scale. Of Sutton, who there is the princely burial at Pritwill, in Essex, discovered in 2003, with its gold cross, and its glass vessels, and its hanging bowls. The burial of an East Saxon prince of the early 7th century. There is the burial at Taplow, in Buckinghamshire, excavated in 1883. There are the great cemeteries of Spong Hill, in Norfolk, with their thousands of cremation urns. There is the recently discovered Staffordshire hoard, found in 2009 by a metal detectorist in a Staffordshire field, which proved to be the largest hoard of Anglo-Saxon gold and silver ever found. More than 3,600 pieces of richly decorated objects, mostly stripped from sword fittings and ceremonial gear, possibly the loot from one or several 7th-century battles, buried by someone who never came back to retrieve it. Each new discovery enriches our picture of the period. Each one chips away a little at the simple word dark and reveals colors underneath. But the silence persists in spite of all the gold. The bowls and the buckles do not speak. The helmets and the spears do not tell us their stories. We can deduce, we can interpret, we can compare with other evidence, but we cannot hear the voices of the people who once held these things, and used them, and were buried with them. The world they lived in has gone, and the documents that might have told us about it were never written, or were lost, or were burned in some later war, or were used as scrap by some medieval scribe to bind a different book. We will never know what songs were sung in Raedwald's hall on the night before he died. We will never know what arguments he had with his queen. We will never know what he believed really about the gods he half worshipped. We will never know the names of the men and women who built his ship and rowed it up the river to its final resting place above the Devon. The same is true on the British side. There are Welsh annals called the Annal Cambria that survive in copies from the 10th century and later which give us a year-by-year list of events going back to the 5th century. They are brief. Each year usually gets 1 or 2 lines, sometimes nothing at all. Battles are noted, deaths of important people, the years of plague, the eclipses of the sun and the moon. There is an entry for the year 516, which reads the Battle of Ben, in which Arthur carried the cross of our Lord Jesus Christ for 3 days and 3 nights on his shoulders, and the Britons were the victors. There is an entry for the year 537, which reads the strife of Camelon, in which Arthur and Medout fell. These are 2 of the very few early references to Arthur that exist, and they are tantalizing. Were these entries copied from older sources that have not survived? Are they the inventions of medieval Welsh writers seeking to anchor their legendary king in real time? We do not know. We cannot prove. We can only note that someone somewhere, by the 10th century at the latest, was writing them down, and that they have been a puzzle ever since. In the year 793, in the early summer on the holy island of Lindisfarne, off the coast of Northland, the monks woke up one morning to find long ships beaching on their shore. The ships had carved prows shaped like serpents and dragons. The men who jumped out of them carried axes and spears, and round wooden shields. They were Northmen from across the sea. They were Vikings. They had come not to settle or to trade, but to raid. They sacked the monastery. They took its treasures. They killed some of the monks and carried others off to be sold as slaves. The news, when it spread, shocked the Christian world. The scholar Alcuin, a Northumbrian who was then working at the court of Charlemagne in Frankish Gaul, wrote a horrified letter back to his homeland, asking how such a thing could have happened, asking what sins must have brought down this judgment on the holy places. The pagan raiders had come back after centuries of Christian peace. The Dark Age, which had been slowly closing, was about to be cracked open again by a new wave of violence from across the sea. The Viking Age which followed was different from the Anglo-Saxon settlement that had preceded. It was better documented. We have annals and chronicles and saints, lives and laws, and poems, and runic inscriptions in real abundance. We can trace the Viking wars almost year by year through the late 9th and 10th centuries. We can follow the rise of Wessex under King Alfred and his successors. We can watch the Danish armies sweep across England, conquering Northumbria and East Anglia and Mere, and then being slowly pushed back and then being absorbed into a New England that had Scandinavian elements knitted into its language and its place names and its laws. By the year 1066, when William the Conqueror crossed the Channel from Normandy and changed everything once again, the Dark Age was long gone. England was a literate, organized, taxed, mapped kingdom with a working royal administration and a network of monasteries and bishops and shires. The 4 centuries of silence between the Romans and the Vikings had ended. The land had come back into the light, into the kind of documented history that we have learned to expect. But the Dark Age never really ends in the sense that we never get to fill in the gaps it left. The 400 missing years between 410 and 800 remain in their essentials missing. We have learned more about them in the last 100 years than at any other time in history. Thanks to archaeology, thanks to careful rereading of the old sources, thanks to scientific techniques that did not exist a generation ago, we have radiocarbon dating, which can tell us when a piece of wood was cut or a bone was the bone of a living creature. We have dendrochronology, which can tell us the year a tree was felled by counting the rings in its grain. We have ancient DNA, which can tell us where the people in a grave came from, who their relatives were, what color hair and eyes they had, whether they were lactose tolerant. We have isotope analysis, which can tell us what the people in a grave ate and where they grew up by looking at the chemical signatures in their teeth. Every year, the picture gets a little richer. Every year, a few new fragments are added to the puzzle. But the puzzle is enormous, and most of the pieces are still missing, and many of them have been ground to dust by the long centuries, and we will never have the whole picture. Some of it is simply gone. And perhaps that is all right. Perhaps it is good for us even to have such a long, deep gap in our historical knowledge sitting there like a dark pool in the middle of our island story. It reminds us that the past is not entirely ours. It reminds us that there are limits to what we can know, no matter how cleverly we dig and how carefully we read. It reminds us that the people who lived in the dark centuries were not waiting for us to come and discover them. They were living their own lives in their own time, by their own light, and the silence they left behind is not their failure. It is just what happens when the years pile up and the records crumble and the memories die. It is the natural state of human affairs to be forgotten. We who live now will be forgotten in our turn in some longer century. The records we keep, the photographs and the documents and the data, will mostly be lost. Our names will be inscribed somewhere, and the inscriptions will weather, and the stones will be moved, and one day, someone will stand at the place where we used to be, and have no idea who was there. The Dark Age is not a strange event. The Dark Age is what all ages eventually become. But in the meantime, while we still have voices, while we still have stories, while we still have the patience to sit in the quiet and listen to the long, slow unfolding of a thing that happened long ago, we can keep something alive. We can remember Vortigern, even if he was not quite the person we think he was. We can remember Hegist and Horsa, even if they were partly mythical. We can remember Ambrosius or Aurelianus in his Roman cloak, rallying the broken Britons. We can remember the unnamed war leader at the top of Ben Hill, who may have been called Arthur or may turn not. We can remember Patrick writing his letter to a tyrant on a bit of parchment in a stone hut in 5th century Ireland. We can remember Athelbert listening politely to the strange Latin chants of Augustine and his monks in a field in Kent. We can remember Bede working in his scriptorum at Jarrow, copying out the deeds of his ancestors in careful, clear handwriting that we can still read. We can remember Rydwald lying in his great ship under the sand of the Suffolk shore. We can remember the unnamed monk of Bangor, Iscoed, killed at the Battle of Chester with 2,000 of his brothers. We can remember the British farmer outside Wroxeter, watching the great Roman city slowly fall down. We can remember the Saxon settler in East Anglia looking west and thinking, "This is mine now." None of them is fully known to us. All of them are partly knowable. Each of them, in their small individual way, lived through the long dark age that we have been walking through, and we owe them the courtesy, at least of remembering that they were there. The night is long, and your room is warm, and the voice is still going gently, and there is no need to stay awake to hear the rest. The story will be there in the morning, if you want to come back to it. The Dark Age has been there for 1,500 years already. It will be there tomorrow. It will be there next week. It will be there next year. It is the patient kind of story. It does not mind waiting. We have walked through the withdrawal of the legions, and the panic of the cities, and the rise of Vortigern, and the coming of Hengist, and the fight of Ambrosius, and the great victory at the unknown hill called Badon. We have walked through the western kingdoms and their hill forts, through Tintagel and South Cardbury and Dinas Pies, through the bishops and the saints and the inscribed stones in the lonely churchyards. We have walked through the climate crisis of 536 and the plague that came after. We have walked through the slow rebirth of literacy with Austenine and Aidan and Bede, through the conversion of the kings and the writing of the laws. We have walked through Sutton, who the gold of its lost king. We have walked slowly all the way down to the long ships of the Viking age coming over the horizon at Lindisfarne. And what is left at the end of all of that walking is the same thing that was there at the beginning: the silence, the long quiet centuries that no one wrote about, where most of the human lives that were lived are gone forever, where what remains is only a scattering of stones and bones and broken pots and a few precious documents, and where we, sitting in our warm rooms 15 centuries later, can only do our best to listen. The silence is not empty. It is full of all the people who once lived and who are gone. It is full of all the words they spoke that no one wrote down. It is full of all the days that came and went, and the rains that fell, and the cattle that were tended, and the children that grew up, and the old people that died peacefully in their beds at the end of concerts. Long, ordinary lives. The silence is the resting place of all of that. The silence is where most of human history lives in the end, when you wait long enough. And so we let the silence have it back, gently, the way you give back a book to its shelf at the end of a long evening of reading. We let the Dark Age return to its dark. We let the names go back into their stones, and the stones go back into their grass. We close our own small chapter in the long story of who has tried to listen. Sleep now. There is nothing else you need to do. The 5th century is behind you. The 6th century is behind you. The 7th century is behind you. The kings have fought their battles, and the saints have prayed their prayers, and the masons have carved their stones, and the bards have sung their songs, and all of it is far away from your warm bed and your quiet room. The night will keep watch. The dark will hold its long memory. You can rest. Tomorrow will come, as it always does, with its small, ordinary tasks, and its small, ordinary kindnesses. And the long centuries will still be there if you ever want to walk through them again. But for now, just for now, you can let it all go. Let the cities crumble back into their grass. Let the ships push back out into their long voyages. Let the kings ride away over the rim of the world. Let the warlords sleep in their hill thoughts, and the monks sleep in their cells, and the farmers sleep in their thatched houses, and the queens sleep in their painted chambers. Let the rivers run on with their British names through their English fields. Let the roads stretch out empty under the stars. Let the moon rise over Stonehenge, and over Tintagel, and over the broken walls of Colon, and over the sand at Sutton Hoo, and over the lonely hill of Ben, wherever that hill may be. Let it all rest exactly where it has rested, for so many centuries already. There is something gentle in the end, about a story whose details have mostly been lost. You do not have to remember the names, because most of the names are not even known. You do not have to keep track of the dates, because most of the dates are uncertain. You do not have to follow the political maneuvering, because most of the politics has dissolved into rumor. The Dark Age is a story that gives you permission to forget. It is a story that has already forgotten most of itself. The fragments that come down to us are like leaves drifting down a slow river, brown and gold, and curled at the edges, going somewhere we cannot quite see. In a current we cannot quite feel. You can watch them go by for a while, and then you can close your eyes and listen to the water, and the leaves will continue without you, and the river will continue without you, and that is fine. That is how it should be. That is how all of these old stories have always wanted to be received. Not held tightly, not memorized, not turned into examinations, just listened to in the dark, with no need for anything in particular to be remembered when the listening is done. The kings of Kent, and the kings of Gwynedd, and the kings of Northumbria, and the kings of Leraclide, and the kings of Wessex are all very far away in their fields of barley and their halls of timber, and they do not need us to do anything in particular for them. They had their lives, they have their long sleep. We can join them now in our own small way for a few hours.